Welcome to Buy the House, Build the Home. Today, we're going to talk inspections, which actually really will. Wow. Can't speak. will, right off the bat. It should actually help you determine if you want to buy the house, right?
That's right.
So why don't you take it away? Because I know you and Lee know each other a bit.
Yes, I have to introduce Lee. I have to. So my story with Lee, he's a phenomenal home inspector. But I was working for this guy. His name was Aaron Anderson, and he owned a lot of properties in the TCU area. And he was talking about, and I didn't know all the ins and outs of the story that Lee shared earlier, but he was talking about basically, well, if we're going to buy the house, we have to have Lee as the inspector. Like, we have to have Lee for any purchases. But if it's time for me to sell one, you better make sure that other agent, that they don't use Lee, because he's so meticulous. He was so incredible at picking out things in the home that other inspectors would glaze over. So we're so excited to have you and all of your expertise. He's the chair of the inspection committee at TREC, the Texas Real Estate Commission. So Lee, tell us a little bit about yourself, how long you've been in the business, what's your favorite part about it?
All right. So I have been doing inspections since 2005, so I'm going on almost 20 years that I've been an inspector. I am the current chair of the Inspector Advisory Committee for the Texas Real Estate Commission. I also sit on the board of directors for Collin County Area Realtors. I'm the past chair of the Property Management Committee for TXR and the current vice chair of Professional Standards.
So you're not busy.
For TR. No,
not at all.
Not at all.
Earlier I was like, does Lee sleep? Do you sleep?
It's undetermined at this point.
It's, little bits and pieces here and there. But honestly, I got involved with the committees because I really wanted to make a difference. There's a lot of people that sit back when things are wrong and they complain about things are wrong, but don't actually step up and do anything. So I wanted to be one of the latter to actually step up and try to make my industry better. I love doing it. I started off by buying, rehabbing, and flipping houses. So I actually have the working knowledge of, I've done a roof and done plumbing and done electrical and all that myself, as opposed to just the book knowledge. So,
which is key.
It makes
huge.
all the difference, I would assume.
A lot of times with this industry, inspections end up being like the second career or the retirement type career for people that worked at a desk for a long time and really don't know anything about the ins and outs of a house, and it can make it extremely difficult. It doesn't always translate into the inspection industry so much. So that makes it tough for people.
And as a realtor, inspections are so critical. In the state of Texas, we have an option period. So you go under option, that's when you get it inspected, and you do your due diligence to see, is this home, what are the
Is it a project?
What are
money
the pitfalls?
pit?
How are the pipes under the house? How is the roof? How is the foundation? What is the electrical situation like? And something I always like to prep my buyers with is just that the codes change every year. And so you have to be on top of all of that, right?
It does change quite a lot. And the option period is typically the time where you have an inspection done, but there is a misconception that's the only time to get an inspection done. In the 1 to 4 family contract, the buyer has the right to inspect the property from execution until closing.
Right.
And a lot of times that gets mixed up. I've had clients or I've had agents tell me, well, the client has no right to an inspection because they have no option period. Well, option period is completely separate from whether
their
they can
option to back out.
Right.
Yeah.
So they can still inspect at any
Right.
point. So that ends up being kind of a little hiccup, but it's the one time I love this industry because my job is to protect people's best interests. My job is to make sure probably what is going to be one of the biggest investments of their lives. Yeah. Not that they buy it or don't buy it, but just they know exactly what's going on inside of it, because every house has problems. Doesn't matter whether it's brand new or 80 years old. There's going to be a whole slew of stuff that's wrong with it. You just, as a buyer, you want to be informed as to exactly what's going on. You can make the determination afterwards, which direction you want to go, but every house is going to have problems. It's just good to know ahead of time what you're getting into before you sign on that dotted line.
Yeah. And I love that Lee always says that. He's like, just so you know, for foundation in the state of Texas, you either have the problems or you will. Right? It's just one of those things with our soil. And so I think it can be a very daunting experience for a buyer because they're like, well, I'm not a plumber. I don't know. And it's like, you don't have to be a plumber, but you do want to go in eyes wide open of, is this going to be something where you might need to replace the pipes later on down the road or whatever. So having a good inspector in your corner, having
Paramount.
It's massive. It's absolutely massive.
Yeah.
Somebody that will really take the time. And I'll have my clients ask you this, like, would you buy this house? Would you let your kid buy this house?
Right.
And it's actually like you'll be really honest.
Mm-hmm.
Like, hey, I mean, I've seen worse, or this one's right on up there with one of the worst I've seen. So
I try to be as nice about it as possible, but it's just sometimes there are some houses I'm bound to be honest, and I treat every house. I've always looked at this from day one to today. Every inspection I go into is the house that my mom is going to buy.
yeah.
And so from multiple different perspectives, like even opening and closing a window. If my mom could open and close that reasonably, I'm okay. If she's going to have a hard time, I'm going to put in the report that window's difficult to open.
Right.
But I also look at it from a number of perspectives as far as that goes, because my mom, I want to make sure she knows exactly what's going on in the house. She's perfectly fine if things are goofy with it or quirky, or because every house is going to. But I want to make sure that everything in there is well known from the get-go, from the start.
Yeah.
Plus, on the backside, if I don't catch everything, my mom will never let me hear the end of it. So it's just, it's good to look at it.
That's the standard. Mom's the standard.
Absolutely.
Do you have clients call you and be like, you didn't tell me about this? Has that ever happened?
It's very rare. It's happened. But one of the most notable that I always find interesting is there's an acronym that a lot of people in the industry use as RDR, realtors don't read. Well, clients don't read either, unfortunately, a lot of times, and that happens. So I had a client walk through the house, was doing his walkthrough after the inspection. He's got 3 kids running around screaming bloody murder and, playing with the seller's toys and stuff like that, and so on and so
I've
forth.
been that agent in that case.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
You're like,
And so there was an add-on on the side of the house that was a converted patio, and they, built it out and whatnot, and it was fine. The house itself looked fine, but the patio I could see was starting to lean. So in the foundation, and part of the conversation we had is like, look, I think the house is fine. I said, but I have to write this up as part of the foundation because now you're incorporating this into the house. I think they just built over the patio slab, which was not designed to hold all this weight.
Yeah.
So I think over time, you're going to see more movement out here because I'm already starting to see separation at the top. Yeah. So I would have this evaluated and find out, go through that whole thing. About 6 months later, the guy calls me screaming on the phone, cussing from the get-go. Not even, hi, how are you? Just cussing from the get-go. And of course, it's 6 months ago. I don't even remember the house.
yeah, who
It's
are
like,
you?
time out. What's the address? Let's start there.
Yeah.
So I go back, I look at the report. And I was like, oh, yeah. I do actually remember this house. I said, you got about 3 kids, right? He's like, yeah. I said, you remember when I told you when we were walking through the house that, can you please, I need you to focus on what I'm telling you because this is important. And I want to make sure that you don't get distracted by them going around and whatnot. Can you have your wife, take the kids or whatnot? Because I really need you to understand what I'm trying to tell you. And he blew it off and never actually went back and looked at the report, just said, oh, this patio is falling off the side of the house. And sure enough, it was a patio slab. And now there was like 1.5 inches to 2 inches of separation at the top of the ceiling because it was just pulling away from the house. And so we had that conversation. I said, by the way, go back and look at the report. He looked at the report. It said exactly what I had told him.
Yeah.
And then he just hung up on me. I'm like, okay. Guess that answers that question.
He realized he couldn't do much more.
He's
like, I'm gonna
Clients
be
don't
done.
read.
So it's just one of those things. But most of the time, if I get a call back, and it's pretty rare if I get a call back, because I try to be as descriptive as possible in the report. But if I get a call back, it's usually because they didn't read.
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of inspectors will do summaries at the end of inspections. I don't. It's perfectly allowed for any inspector to do that. There's no restriction. We actually had that come through the inspector committee about prohibiting summaries. I don't like summaries, but I don't think it should be TREC's purview to tell home inspectors that they can't do it. So I just let them choose if they want to. The problem is you put a summary, that's all people will read.
Yeah.
They will not read anything else on the report. And there's a lot of complaints that come through TREC that are dismissed because they say the inspector didn't find this because they're reading the summary, but it's actually in the report and they didn't read the report. So
I would probably be one of those people that would
happens.
be guilty of that.
Yeah, well,
I'm a Cliff Notes person. Like, I don't have the attention span.
a lot of people are.
But in this setting, like, please have the attention span.
I will
This is
say,
huge
as a realtor, like, the
purchase.
summary is very helpful.
Absolutely.
Because you just go through and you're like, okay, that's, sometimes it's like, there's no anti-tip device on the stove. And it's like, well, that's because they didn't make the stoves like that, because it didn't used to be a problem until one day some kid got on top of the stove and it fell over on him. So now they have anti-tip.
Personally, I think the kid's only going to do it once, but that's just me.
But all that to say, when you can kind of skim through and go, so I get your reports and I'm like, well, let's get on in there, because I can't get the Cliff's Notes.
But I do also, at the end of my reports, I make a special effort to really have a conversation with the client and agent.
Yeah.
Fortunately, if the agent is there, which you always do, which is great.
Yeah.
To have that conversation, say, look, I can give you my realistic viewpoint here, talking one-to-one. The report is a legal document, so it's got to be fact-based. It's got to be boom, boom, boom. This is right. This is wrong. This is wrong. This is wrong. So I think having that conversation is important. And even if the client can't be there, because sometimes work, life, whatever the case may get in the way, I'll have a phone conversation with them before I send them the report.
Yeah, which is great. Yeah. And you do want an inspector that's going to have those conversations, because I think sometimes it's your job to pick everything apart, right? So it can just be very scary. And when you can go, hey, that's really not a big deal. It's very common. I see it all the time. This is what you can expect. Or,
That's more of a flag.
You might want to be concerned about this, more of a red flag. So it's important to have those conversations.
I'll usually give like a top 3 at the end of the conversation. Like, here's everything we've gone through, and I'm a realistic person. I'm not a scare tactic, making mountains out of molehills type stuff. Most of it is like new code versus old code stuff, especially when you're dealing with older houses. But I'll also at the very end say, look, these are kind of my top 3 concerns that I think you probably should really, find out what's going on.
Investigate a bit more.
Which is great, because when you are going back to the seller, let's say for repairs, what you don't want to do, and I've had clients do this, they ask for 50 things, and I have to say,
you know what, $3 item at Home Depot. Let's not lose the house because of this.
And you know what the seller's going to do? They're going to pick those 5 items that are super easy, quick fix. Oh, the doorknob's loose, right? Or they're going to get angry and be like, we're doing nothing. Whereas if you just cherry pick the top, the top few that are very important, then that's when you go, hey, and it's way easier realtor to realtor to negotiate when you've got a reasonable ask versus an unreasonable ask.
Yeah. I would love to know some red flags. Like, when you're in a house, you immediately think, nope. I know my mom and I, when I was very young, we moved to Texas when I was 10, and I remember house searching with her. And my memory's probably a little foggy. But we actually were out in Rome, Texas, and fell in love with this old house. My mom grew up on a farmhouse in Iowa, so we're like, oh my gosh, we're home. The inspector came out, and he's like, yeah, the house is not even on secure, like, pier and beam. It's on rocks. And we were like, okay, we're going to bow out. Bye. And then we went to another house that we fell in love with, and the inspector came out, and he's like, yeah, one strong wind, the house will fall down, and it has termites. And we're like, okay, we're going to bow out. And so I would love to know some of those just major flags that it would be hard to overcome, or you're going to sink a lot of money into it. So
foundation is the one thing that is usually the biggest red flag for people. We have a lot of people coming from out of state, California, New York, whatnot. So whenever I see a client that's coming out of there, I have to have a conversation to start off about foundations. Because in California, the ground doesn't move unless there's an earthquake. Out here, it moves constantly. They have to have straps on their water heaters, to keep them in case of an earthquake and moving. We don't. There's a number of different things that happen, but foundations, like we talked about earlier, I tell people there's 2 types of foundations. Foundations that have problems and foundations that will. It's just a matter of time. It's going to move around. The soil is very expansive. When it gets wet, it heaves up. When it dries up, it shrinks down. Drainage ends up being a big culprit in foundation problems. But most foundation problems can be fixed pretty reasonably at a reasonable cost if there's actually repairs that are needed. If you have a break in the drain line underneath the house or water supply line, that can be a multi-headed problem, because one, it will cause saturation of the soil, which will cause heaving. Well, you go under there, and I've had a client that actually fixed a leak in the middle of the house. So they put piers all along the outside to bring the outside back up to level. They fixed the leak. Well, now that soil is drying out.
The internal.
And so it's shrinking. And so now the house turns into a big bowl. And now you have to put piers in the middle of the house to get the middle of the house back up. When all you had to do was just fix the drain leak, and the house would eventually settle back in on itself. So you have to be really careful, and there's never really a single answer to a foundation problem because so much relies on drainage and water and other things. Sometimes you can fix a foundation problem just by putting a French drain on the outside or adding gutters to a house, a number of different ways to get the water away from the house effectively and not deal with the foundation and just move it. So, but a lot of people, especially coming from out of state, they see cracks in the walls and they immediately start freaking out.
Scares them.
I mean, even brand new houses, when the lumber goes into the house that's being built, it's wet and it takes a couple of years for that to dry out. And as it dries out, it shrinks and you get little cracks in your corners and stuff like that. It's okay. It is what it is. Slab will be stable for a longer period of time, typically, but they're expensive to fix. Pier and beams will move around constantly, but they're much easier to fix.
Cheaper.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can get under there with a couple 8-ton car jacks and shim the house up and level it out and be perfectly fine.
Right.
So there's goods and bads to others, but foundation usually is typically the big red flag for a lot of people. And if I see a house that needs foundation work, it doesn't freak me out.
Yeah.
It's what's causing it, how long has it been? If a house has already had foundation repair, I actually think it's a good thing because somebody has paid for the inevitable, and more than likely there's going to be some type of warranty that goes along with it if it's from a reputable company. But foundation companies are not licensed in Texas, so that's a huge risk as well.
Yeah, that's something I often tell my clients. Like, if there's a transferable warranty, that's amazing. It's very common, but you got to look at what the company is, because a lot of times these mom and pop comes and then they end up going bankrupt.
Out of
and
business.
Guess what? That warranty is nothing. So I'm a big proponent of some of the larger foundation companies. Permapier, MBR is my favorite. I've got a great guy out there, but it's a big deal. But you want to know what freaks me out? An earthquake. Can you imagine the whole earth shaking? I'm like, they're scared of cracks in the walls.
It's not quite that scary.
You get used to it. I mean,
the ground is moving.
I grew up with it. You'd be sitting laying on the floor watching TV and it's just, that's not even a 5-pointer.
People freak out about tornadoes in Texas, and I was used to those. But I'm like, an earthquake is terrifying.
Earthquakes, not a big deal.
Anyways, cracks in the walls, not a big deal, but you do want to get it evaluated.
Yeah, and if it does have if it has had foundation repairs and it's got a warranty on it, there's typically a couple things that I always mention, and I even put this in the report. One, make sure they did a static pressure test on the drain lines to make sure that when they jacked the house up, they didn't break the drain lines underneath the house. And with the transferable warranty, a lot of times there's stipulations to it. There's usually a fee that goes along with it, and there's usually a time frame that goes along with it. 30 days from closing, 60 days from closing, whatnot. And you have to be really careful to read that fine print to know what that time frame is, because once people close on a house, the world goes crazy for 6 months, and it's very easy to miss that deadline. And then day 31, so sad, you don't have a warranty anymore.
Yeah,
right.
So, and it's not as much, it's a huge benefit to you as a buyer to have that transferable warranty, but it's an even bigger benefit for you to be able to transfer that to another potential buyer down the road.
Yeah.
And you don't want to lose that warranty.
Absolutely.
That is a big deal.
Agreed. On our first house that we owned, we've used the warranty a couple of times already on the foundation. So I'm thankful that we have that in place.
Yeah. I had an agent reach out to me on the sale of a house from like 5 years ago, furious because they didn't transfer the warranty. And it wasn't on the seller to do. I mean, you have to be on top of that with your client. And really, I try to make sure that it's signed at the closing table, just to make sure that doesn't get slipped through the cracks, because it's something that you do kind of forget about. So, and
that's why I've always put that on my inspection reports. If I see that it's had repairs, I put a little stipulation in there. Hey, make sure if there's a transferable warranty, make sure there's a time frame, static pressure test on the drain lines, that type of stuff too. Cast iron is another red flag. Cast iron drain lines. I usually tell people it's not if, it's when. At some point, it's going to have to be replaced. Yeah. It's just kind of the way it is.
They deteriorate, and they're not meant to last forever. And at this point, they've probably already been under there for forever.
Yep.
Learn from our mistakes. We have spent $80K on plumbing in the last 3 years in both the houses that we own.
It's not cheap.
I have warned friends. We had a sweet couple friend that were buying a house and used a different realtor at that time. And I said, please, 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 because the house was like 1960s. I was like, get a plumber out there. The inspector is not going to be able to fully catch. He can kind of give you an indication if it's cast iron. And they were advised that it wasn't a big deal. And they've spent, I think it was within their first like 6 months of being there, they've spent about $45K now, replacing all of that. And she's like, I will listen to you in the future. I'm like, thank you. So anyone I know, because a lot of younger individuals right now are buying older homes because that's what they can afford. And I'm like, please, like you said, it's just a matter of age, and we're at that point.
Yeah.
So I think it's 1980s that they stopped using
Yeah,
cast
right
iron,
about
roughly.
80s. I kind of correlate it with lead, you know.
Lead-based
Yeah.
paint.
So right about
78.
that time. And I've had a couple of 80s houses that had cast iron, but for the most part in the 80s, it was pretty much gone. I usually tell people, it's like, look, just because it's got cast iron doesn't mean don't walk away by any means. You just need to know what you're getting into. It may be good for another 6 years.
That's the thing.
But at some point, you're going to have to address it. So before you get too far into this deal, I would have a plumber go in and actually scope that thing out. Now, some inspectors have started doing sewer scopes because the plumbing board stopped prohibiting inspectors from doing it. Some inspectors will do it, but you got to be real careful. Number one, when an inspector does it, he's not a plumber. He doesn't really know exactly what he's looking at. And it's so easy. I've done those scopes to miss something very, very small in there that it's going to cost a lot of money.
Yeah.
And if you have an inspector come in and do the scope and you try to give that information to a plumber, he's not going to accept it. He's going to do his own scope.
right.
He's going to charge you again for his own
So you
scope.
might as well just-
So you might as well just
go
do that.
direct.
I mean, there's no sense in spending it on the front side when you're going to have to spend it again on the back side anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
And that's something I'll tell my clients often. I'm like, this could completely fall apart 6 days after you close, or it could be 6 months, or it could be 6 years, or it could be 12 years. You know, you don't really know. I mean, with the pipes, you can kind of see this is on its last leg, but you just want to know. It's like you said, you don't have to necessarily walk away.
Right.
But are you okay with if this comes down the line? Now, if you do, like what you spent on your home, when you go to sell it, you have already replaced the cast iron pipes with PVC.
Yeah.
That's going to be a huge selling point. It does add value, even from an appraisal standpoint, when you've replaced things like an HVAC unit or a roof or anything like that. It definitely adds value, but it's all about going in knowing. And I always
Eyes wide open.
Yeah, and I tell people, I'm like, how bad do you want the house? You know, like, is this something that you're like, you know what? Let's keep looking. This is kind of scary, and but also it depends on your price point, what kind of deal you're getting. All of that plays into it. So, being able to have someone say like, get a plumber, come get a passing hydrostatic plumbing test.
Yep.
I just wrote that up in a repair amendment the other day. It's like, the seller, we're going to make sure that all active leaks are fixed on this thing and that there's no current leaks on the property. That to me is something that a seller needs to fix, unless you're buying the house as is. Right. So any active leaks on the property, gas leaks, anything like that, a seller needs to fix, in my opinion, whether the buyer's going to buy it or not. Like, if you're just living there, you need to have that taken care of, right? So that's something I always, as I'm looking at these reports, I'm like, there are certain things I'm like, this is on the seller.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, even with foundation stuff, like, they get in there and they're going to fix the foundation later. They go in there and there's a pipe burst, it's like you said. Like, then all of a sudden that estimated cost is way higher so some things I definitely will recommend for my client to have the seller repair. And an active leak is one of those that nobody should be buying a house unless it's as is and you've got the right deal. Nobody should be buying a house with an active leak on the property.
I agree with that. Lee, do you ever get asked by a client, like, what would you repair? What would you ask the seller to repair?
Yeah, it's a common thing we get asked about. The fact is, like I said, every house needs repairs, but what you should ask for is completely dependent on so many different factors. Right. So the inspector's job is to go in and let you know everything that's going on with the house. But we have so much limited information about that particular client or the seller, whatever the case may be. And so many of those factors have a huge part in determining what you're going to ask for, whether you're going to ask for the seller to repair them or give you monetary concessions,
right,
at the end of the report. Every house, the contract, you're buying the house as is, you have to amend the contract in order to get any repairs done or money off, so on and so forth. There are some repairs that you may want the seller to do because the contract requires licensed individuals to do them. Yeah. But seeing as we only have plumbers, electricians, and HVAC that actually have a license, roofers, foundation companies, and general contractors do not. That can be a little bit of a gray area sometimes. So plus I don't know as an inspector if that buyer is paying top dollar for that house and there was no competition for it, in which they may have a lot more, may have a lot more play. Yeah. Or if they lowball the living daylights out of that seller and they have very little negotiation. Yeah. If I go in there not knowing that, saying, I think you should ask for A, B, C, and D, that buyer thinks that's what should happen. Right, and if it doesn't happen, they back out. Yeah. The real estate agent is the one who actually has the information. They know what's probably going on with the seller. They certainly know what's going on with the buyer. Right. Yeah. They're going to help make that better determination. I don't know if my client is a licensed electrician. So he may have no problem with any electrical stuff. He's like, I want the money off because I'm going to do it myself. Yeah. I don't know that information. You guys, the agents, you'll know that. So an inspector, I'm going to tell you what should be fixed at some point, which are going to be the health and safety issues. But every house is going to have a number of things. Don't go trying to fix every single thing that's there. The health and safety issues, those are the ones you really need to address that correlate with the big five: foundation, roof, plumbing, electrical, essentially in there.
Okay. I love that.
Absolutely. And I tell people as well, I'm like, whenever you're looking at these reports, you do have to take into consideration, hey, we got this thing $30,000 less than asking, and we asked the seller to already contribute $15,000 in cost concessions, right? So you have to, that it all plays into it.
Don't nitpick at that point.
Right, exactly. But if you are paying top dollar, and oftentimes if a seller is elderly or sick, like for in those cases, they're not really going to want to be messing with calling up an HVAC company, all that.
It's probably easier to maybe give you more money. On a
cost concession, right? So it is all dependent on, and I appreciate you not like saying you should do this, because then you do have that expectation that later the agent has to go, okay, well,
maybe unravel it a bit.
Does the inspector know that they that we're $30,000 under asking price, and there's an appraisal showing that it's worth more than that? I mean, there's all kinds of factors,
and we don't know. And the fact is, inspectors need to stay in their lane. That's just all there is to it. We're very good. Most, just like with every industry, you have certain bad apples, but most inspectors, most of my colleagues are very, very good at what they do. But our job is to tell them everything that's wrong, not to determine what happens afterwards.
Right. We should have a podcast called Stay in Your Lane.
That is a whole, this could be a spinoff. I don't feel like spinoffs too. I don't feel like spinoffs typically take off like the rest, though. Do they?
Probably not, but that's okay.
Track that back. You mentioned clue reports. Clue us in on what that is.
Clue us in on
clue reports.
See what I did there?
So every so often I'll mention clue reports. Clue report is basically like a Carfax for houses when it comes to the insurance company. So a lot of times with houses, especially if you've had a lot of visible repairs and stuff like that, I typically recommend have a client call their insurance carrier, have them pull a clue report. Most of them will do it for free. Some of them may charge you a very small amount. Some will charge a very small amount. But specifically, if there's previous water leaks in the house, you're going to want to know about that. One of the big ones that comes up is roofs, because roofs get repaired and replaced so often because we have so many different storms. If you're a property owner and you get an insurance claim to replace a roof and they give you $15,000 to replace the roof and you decide to just patch it, you can do that as a seller. There is nothing illegal about that. However, that insurance company will not reinsure that roof until you show proof that it's been repaired. Well, unfortunately, what happens sometimes, people rob Peter to pay Paul. Yeah. And they have other things going on in their life. They take that money from the roof stuff, they patch it, keep the other $12,000 and whatnot. Yeah. Well, now the buyer goes in, looks, the inspector comes, sees, a bunch of repairs. If I see a lot of patchwork that's been done on a house, I'm absolutely going to recommend them get a clue report, because you may find out that that's the case. Yeah. And the problem you run into is that buyer is going to buy the house. Their insurance company is going to bind the coverage upon closing, and then about 2 or 3 months later, they send an adjuster out to make sure a house is actually standing there, and they go, "Oh, we're not covering that roof," and now that client is on the hook for a roof, and they have to pay to replace the entire roof.
Yeah, and I always get a roofer to come and at least write up a letter stating this thing is insurable or not, and I mean sometimes they can't fully tell, and then sometimes we have to get seller to file a claim with their insurance company to determine, and then sometimes they'll come back and you end up getting a new roof put on for the buyer. But if you don't have someone looking out for that, and those clue reports are important, because I've seen that happen. I've had family members do that where they're like, "Well, we took the money," and I'm like,
And if there's enough damage up there, I don't think it's a bad idea to ask the seller, hey, have your insurance company go up and take a look at it. One of two things is going to happen. The company's going to go, yep, needs a new roof. Okay, fine. You get a new roof. Seller pays the deductible, moves on. Even if seller has no money and the buyer pays the deductible, paying the deductible for the seller is a lot less than paying for a whole new roof.
Yeah.
Or the insurance company is going to go, no, there's some damage, but it's still insurable as it is. You take that piece of paper, you put it in your back pocket, and you just hold on to it. And then if your insurance company, you're the buyer, if your insurance company after the fact says, nope, this isn't insurable, you have some documentation from another insurance company that says, yes, it's insurable.
Right.
So it puts you in a better position to get that insured with your company, or worst case, go back to that original company that said it's insurable, and now you know they can insure it. So again, the whole goal is to not be on the hook for a roof.
Yeah.
Okay. I love that. Well, before we wrap up.
Yeah, before we wrap up, I have a very important question. What is like one of the worst things you've seen? Like I know you've been in so many houses. Literally earlier you told us about getting bit by a dog.
Also, you got stuck and dug your way out with a screwdriver.
Dug your way out with a screwdriver. Modern day hero over here. But like
dug myself out. I don't know if I call myself a hero.
Well, no. Well, you're
modern day survival.
I need to watch what I eat is more like it.
Oh my gosh. So, what's one of your like horror stories?
So, two of them come to mind. One was, I think, my first week of inspecting. And I went out to East Texas, out in the middle of nowhere, and I went to go inspect a rental house for a property owner. And I went under, and there's like this dead plant sitting next to the foundation access to crawl underneath. I moved the plant, and the plant wasn't dead. It was alive. It was just so covered with bugs. It was green. It just looked gray because there were so many bugs on it. I go underneath there, and when I get underneath the house, I keep smelling this smell, and I'm thinking, I got to crawl under the house. And all the drain lines under the house were broken. All the cast iron was broken, and all the sewage was just collecting underneath the house. And people were living in it. And
people were living in
it? They were living in it.
And they couldn't smell it?
They got used to it. Because what happens is in our brains, when things happen slowly and they slowly trickle up, you just don't realize how bad it's getting. So, but then I've only had one house where I've actually told a client, do not buy this house.
Okay.
And it was in McKinney. There was a rehabber doing the work, and he was still finishing up some work as I was there. And it was in the historic area. You know, they were doing a lot of work, or just outside the historic area because they didn't want to pay enough for all the stuff he had to be required to do. But the client was elderly on a fixed income. She was paying cash for things. She has no income. She's just going to pay cash, so on and so forth. And I knew her situation. But when I'm about halfway through the inspection, I'm watching the work that these contractors are doing, and I'm seeing the final product.
Yeah.
And I just got halfway through it, and I finally called her up. I said, I'm just going to go ahead and stop this inspection. You need to not buy this house. I said, I'm a firm believer in everything is fixable, and there's a lot of stuff. But I'm going to write up a whole slew of stuff, and this seller's going to agree to repair it, and he's going to do it at the same quality that I'm watching him do. And I'm watching these guys cut corners and not care who's looking. Yeah. And I was like, again, goes back to my mom buying the house. It's like, you are not buying this house. I said, you just need to walk away and stop. I'm not going to charge you for the full inspection. We'll just do a quick trip charge and whatnot, but we just need to stop because that just needs to not happen. And unfortunately, that does happen quite a bit. You get a lot of guys that watch HGTV and think they're rehabbers, and they go in and they just put lipstick on a pig, and it happens very, very often. So just got to be cautious of that.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I have personally so enjoyed having you here.
Oh, thank you.
And all of your knowledge, Mr. Chairman.
It's a new nickname.
Seriously, thank you for taking time out of your busy day of inspections to come and chat with us a little bit and help educate our audience on all things inspections.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for letting me.
What is the best way for people to get in contact with you if they need an inspection?
Phone is the best way. My number is 469-682-0341, or lee@prospectinspectors.com. Either way. I don't have any other inspectors that work for me. If I book the inspection, it will always be me and only me that does the inspection. So I don't hire anybody else. I don't trust anybody else to look at a house the same way that I will. So
that makes sense.
Awesome. Well, there we have it.
There we have it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.